Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the Arlington Human Rights Commission's 5th Annual Tiffany Joslyn Human Rights Forum. My name is Bill Rice, and I'm a member of the Arlington Human Rights Commission. The commission, which was established under Chapter 31 of the Arlington County Code, handles complaints of discrimination in Arlington County related to employment, housing, public accommodations, education, credit, and commercial real estate. The Commission also functions to gather, discuss, and disseminate information about discrimination and human rights problems affecting community life in Arlington. Before we get started, we want to make everyone aware of this year's James B. Hunter Awards on Thursday, December 9th at 7 p.m. The awards will be presented to individuals, community groups, nonprofit organizations, and business establishments that promote cultural diversity and equal rights for all residents. The nominations form winner of the James B. Hunter Award, the late Tiffany Joslyn, an attorney and Arlington resident who served on the Human Rights Commission and was an active LGBTQ advocate. Tiffany was a member of the Arlington LGBTQ group AGLA, was president of the LGBTQ Democrats of Virginia PAC, and was active in the Arlington Young Democrats and the Arlington County Democratic Committee. After Tiffany passed away in 2016, this forum was named in her honor. This year's forum is focusing on the subject of restorative justice. We'll be taking a look at what's happening here in Arlington and across Virginia to promote and implement restorative justice throughout our criminal justice system. And in order to get some more background on this subject, we're going to play you a short video explaining the concept of restorative justice and contrasting it to other criminal justice philosophies. So if you give me a moment, I'm going to pull this video up here.
Training our body.
Crime hurts, then justice should heal. That's Fanya Davis. It makes sense, right? Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. In the U.S., there are 2.2 million people behind bars and nearly 5 million on probation and parole in a system of mass incarceration laden with racial injustices that disproportionately affect minority communities. 1 out of every 14 children has a parent in prison, destroying the health, stability, and resources of entire communities. This is the retributive justice system, and it operates on the theory that punishing people for crime makes them stop. It's hugely expensive, destructive to the human spirit, and worst of all, it doesn't work. Psychiatrist James Gilligan even calls it the most powerful stimulant of violence that we've yet discovered. People are looking for another system. Fortunately, there is one. It's called restorative justice. It focuses less on punishing the crime and more on holding people accountable in order to heal the harm. Restorative justice is based on who we really are. We're designed to live in community, to be of service to one another, and to nurture and repair our relationships. Where the retributive system asks, who did it, what rule was broken, and how do we punish them? Restorative justice asks, what is the harm? Who has been harmed? How do we repair it? Here's how it works. All the stakeholders get a chance to be heard in a facilitated process that balances the needs of victims, offenders, and the community. The person harmed explains how he or she was hurt. This itself is healing as it meets the need for acknowledgement, validation, and repair. The person who did the harm is held accountable in a new way. They're also given the opportunity to accept responsibility for their actions, which is also healing, share their perspectives, and to make amends for the harm they caused in the relationships that were broken. The whole community has a chance to address the underlying problems that gave rise to the situation, and then everyone works together to find a way to restore balance and offer healing to all stakeholders. In restorative and community justice, the concept of beloved community and living in right relationship is key. You're restoring justice and just relationships within the whole community. Does it work? Well, look at this. In the prison system, wherever restorative justice is tried, recidivism has plummeted. In schools, switching to restorative justice drops suspension, improving students' educational and social well-being, while reducing bullying and other manifestations of violence. And it costs next to nothing by comparison. One teacher said, "Every time I used the retributive system, I lost a relationship. Every time I use this new system, I gain one." Restorative justice is justice that works, justice that transforms, justice that heals. Now that sounds like something we all want more of in our communities, so spread the word in yours.
And now that we have that background, to speak more to us about restorative justice tonight, we have an amazing set of panelists who are very knowledgeable on the subject and who also work extensively in this field. So speaking first with us will be Sheba Williams. Sheba is the founder and executive director of No Left Turns, a Virginia nonprofit organization focused on criminal justice reform. Born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, Sheba founded No Left Turns in 2016 in order to reduce recidivism and help individuals who have experienced court and justice involvement thrive post-conviction. No Left Turns also works as an advocacy organization, fighting day to day to help further policies that remove barriers and stigma for those with past convictions. And Sheba and No Left Turns have been extremely active in fighting for some of the key criminal justice reforms we've seen recently passed at the General Assembly, such as recent legislation around automatic expungement. Speaking after that will be Brad Haywood. Brad is the executive director of Justice Forward Virginia, a nonpartisan criminal justice reform advocacy organization. Brad also serves as the chief public defender for the Office of Public Defender for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church. As executive director of Justice Forward, Brad works to bring attention to the urgent needs for criminal justice reform in the Commonwealth at the most fundamental level, and to advance legislation and support candidates who advocate for comprehensive reforms to Virginia's criminal justice system. And our final speaker is Parissa Dagani-Tofty, the Commonwealth's attorney for Arlington County and the City of Falls Church. Parissa has spent her career working in various capacities to further criminal justice reform. She worked as an innocence protection attorney as the legal director for the Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project, helping exonerate innocent individuals who had been wrongfully convicted. She has worked as a public defender with the District of Columbia's Public Defender Service, and during her time in office as Commonwealth's attorney, Parissa has continued her work to achieve a fair and more just criminal justice system. And with that, we'll turn it over to our first speaker, Sheba Williams of No Left Turns.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me tonight. My name is Sheba Williams, as previously mentioned. I am a Richmond, Virginia native. No Left Turns is the organization that I founded in 2016 in the wake of a national election that would change our nation. My story is personal. My family history in criminal justice is personal, and that is what really led me to start the organization in 2016. I was wrongfully convicted in 2004. At 10 years old, both my parents were incarcerated. My sister was wrongfully arrested in 1999. She spent 6 months in jail before she was ultimately acquitted, but still lived with the trauma of the arrest. My husband was arrested at the age of 15, tried as an adult, and sentenced to 74 years. As a child, he was one of the youngest in the state to be in Southampton Regional Prison. And as a result of that, he ended up in solitary confinement for the majority of his incarceration, which took a long-term effect on our family history and led me to where I am today. The fight is personal, but it is not just about me and my family. It is about my community, my state, my country, my neighbor. It is about you. It is about people who have no contact with the justice system. It is about the trauma that is caused by the carceral systems. It is about the youth who experience losing their parents to the carceral systems. It is about the community that people come back to, because 95% of people who go into incarceration in the state of Virginia and beyond return to our communities. The reason why I got into the work was because I was angry. I was angry at a system that was designed to take away many people from our communities. The idea was punishment. It was never about rehabilitation. We're moving into a design now that says that we want to heal people who are impacted by mass incarceration. Before we get to the solution to the problem, we have to go to the history. We all know about the 1994 crime bill, and we know how it impacted the war on drugs in our communities. We know how our communities suffer from lack of resources, and we know that the mantra was lock them up and throw away the key. The 1994 crime bill destroyed communities and families. There was no rule to say, how do we reintegrate people back into community successfully? And that in turn led to more crime in our communities. Broken people had to come out and figure out a way to live with a felony that was forever. They had to manage with all of the legal terms of discrimination against a person who had a criminal background check. Because if we look at today, 2021, even in the wake of all of the wins that we had in these very recent special sessions and special sessions and special sessions and other sessions, we still have so far to go. In July 2021, a historic bill was passed to say that for the first time in the history of Virginia, some people who have past criminal convictions will be allowed to seal their record so that they can move on with their lives and no longer be impacted by the one moment in their life that they have to answer to forever. But there are so many people left behind. To rehabilitate a community, we have to look forward and say, how does this benefit the overall community and state to make sure that our economics is great? So let's go back to the beginning. If we are looking at the upcoming election and all of the articles and things that we see in front of us, we are looking at 1994 all over again. We see fear mongering. We hear that crime is rising, and we hear that we have to do the thing that takes people away from their communities, because if we don't lock people up, we won't be safe. But is safety about you? Is safety about your family? Is safety about your community and your neighbors, or is safety about this entire state? If we say yes to those things, we say that people who have done harm in the past should belong in the conversation when we are talking about public safety. The failed war on drugs damaged communities. We saw things like recreation centers being removed. We saw gentrification. We are seeing it at a rampant pace, and gentrification does not start from the past 2 or 3 years. It starts from a 10-year point where people look at the census and say, who is making the least amount of money? Whose median income is the least, and how can we take their property and shift them out? That in itself is a crime. If we're talking about the history of the 1994 crime bill, where people were denied the opportunity to have social services programs that benefited them and allowed them economic passage into a greater right of family wealth, we know that taking away the opportunity for support and help led to more crime than not. So tonight we're here to talk about restorative justice and how we get into that, but we could not start the conversation without going into the history of how Virginia got here. We allow laws to be made to damage communities and not be accountable for what was being done to people. People were not centered in the conversation when laws were made, like mandatory minimums. We recently abolished the death penalty. There was no accountability for the number of Black and brown people who were disparately impacted by that crime system and were innocent lives taken in the midst of that lock them up and throw away the key period. So I will pass it to Brad, but I want you all to think about all of the things in history that got us to today and how we move forward from here on out. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheba. Great points, especially about centering those who are the most impacted in the policymaking. And now we'll hear from Brad Haywood of Justice Ford, Virginia.
Hi, everyone. I think this was mentioned at the beginning, but in addition to Justice Forward Virginia, I run the public defender's office in Arlington County in the city of Falls Church. So indigent defense and criminal justice reform is pretty much my whole life. And I am where I am right now because I believe criminal justice reform to be the civil rights issue of my generation. I believe it's fundamentally about racial justice, equal justice, social justice. In discussing our topic tonight, I want to step back a little bit and take a bigger picture view, because restorative justice is a smaller component of a refocusing of advocacy energy on making our criminal legal system work better. And as an introduction, I'm going to say a word that I never say because I don't think it's good messaging. And that word is defunding. And I know it is a controversial word. That's why I don't like it. I don't like it because it sounds like something it isn't. But what I do like is what I understand it to mean, or at least what I understand it to mean as coming from people who are like-minded. And what it means, as I understand it, is reducing our reliance on police and prisons to solve our social problems. And that's in order to make our communities safer, healthier, and more equitable. That's not controversial. I think everybody here, probably everybody watching, even police officers probably agree with that framing of what that is. Everybody wants to reduce reliance on police and prisons. And why do we want to do that? Because we all know that we have a criminal legal system right now that relies far too much on arrest, prosecution, and punishment, and that it isn't working. You heard a little bit about why it isn't working in the video we watched. Right now, the United States has about 5% of the world's population, but we have nearly a quarter of the world's prison population. We spend more on law enforcement in the United States than all but two countries spend on their militaries, and those two countries are the United States and China. You figure with all of that policing and imprisonment that we'd be much safer than other wealthy countries, right? We aren't. Nonviolent crime rates are about the same as they are in Europe, and maybe a little bit higher. And violent crime rates in the U.S. are much higher. They're much higher than they are in Europe. So not only is our reliance on police and other wealthy countries, not only is our reliance on police and prisons to solve social problems not making us any safer, but it is creating a tremendous injustice on people and communities of color. And Arlington, people like to say, well, these aren't our problems. These aren't Arlington problems. They are Arlington problems. Arlington is maybe one of the best examples of how racial disparities have been visited on people and communities of color in the United States. 9% of our county is Black. I think, as a lot of people heard a couple of years ago during a Campbell's attorney race, nearly 60% of the people who were prosecuted for marijuana possession when it was still illegal were Black. Over 50% of the people arrested in Arlington for most misdemeanors are Black. And our local jail population is typically over 50% Black. So not only are we wasting resources on arrest and punishment, but the way we're doing so is racist. So that's not the only way in which Arlington remains tied to this old approach that isn't working. Recently, this one way that our system has been under a microscope is Arlington is known for having a disproportionate number of people with serious mental illness involved in its criminal legal system. There's part of that is, I think, because there are more people with serious mental illness in Arlington, but we have so many that we have more people in Western State Hospital. It's a psychiatric hospital for people in the criminal legal system, involved in the criminal legal system, who've been arrested. We have more people in that hospital right now than any other jurisdiction in the whole state. And the size of our criminal courts, it really isn't that large. So that should be that's a sort of a stark reminder of what's going on in Arlington. Now, some of that is, like I said, just because more people with serious mental illness live here, but another part is just more of them are being arrested. And part of a reason for that is both our approach, but also our institutions and our infrastructure. We lack the capacity to do things the way they ought to be done, a more humane way. For example, we just lack enough mental health beds. We have a crisis unit right now at our Department of Human Services that is rarely fully staffed. You can't even take a lot of people who are in crisis. And what happens? They end up being arrested. And our criminal courts also remain very punitive. In many felony probation violations, for example, this is one of the ways we contribute to mass incarceration in Arlington. But in many of them, and our court, our circuit court, imposes sentences that are about 3 times longer than in neighboring jurisdictions. So, you know, what are we doing? Why is this all happening? And as Sheba said, a lot of this is the war on drugs. A lot of it is because tough on crime policies have been thought to be winning politics. And I think we just have become a society that believes that this way we've been doing things, that it really does solve our problems, when there is just so much evidence that the way we're doing things doesn't do that. So restorative justice is a component of this, but there are other very large components of it as well. And we're working on those in Arlington, we're working on them statewide. We want our system to work better. And thankfully, right now, at least, we have elected officials in Arlington who share that mission. We also have statewide leaders who share that mission. And I can tell you over the course of the past 18 months, Democrats in particular in Virginia have truly reshaped our criminal legal system, at least on a procedural level, and with respect to some really arcane ways that we approach certain types of crimes. So we used to be in the ice age of criminal justice. Last year, we got out of the ice age and into the stone age. And I think earlier this year in this last legislative session, we're actually finally out of the stone age and we're kind of middle of the pack nationwide. We can do better than that. Arlington is a community that's blessed to have a very extraordinarily low crime rate and tremendous public servants, including at our Department of Human Services, our Commonwealth Attorney's Office, our sheriff. People who are committed to making this work. We ought to be the shining city on the hill is what we ought to be. We ought to be leading the way, and I think we can lead the way. And I'm really excited about what we've done and what the future holds. So I'll turn it over to Parissa.
Thanks, Brad. Those statistics were very helpful, especially bringing up the disparities we see both in Arlington and statewide. And I would just add, we also see that in the school level as well, with more punitive measures being leveled towards students who are Black or brown, or students who have disabilities. So with that, I'll turn over to our final panelist, Parissa.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am really excited to be here, and I think it's a unique time to be talking about criminal justice reform in a human rights forum, and I am delighted that we are at a place where we are actually doing that and looking at our criminal legal system as a human rights issue. Professor Abby Smith of Georgetown wrote an article over 20 years ago entitled, "Can you be a good person and a good prosecutor?" And she answered at the time her own question with a negative. And later, just a few years ago, Professor Angela Davis, who, like me, is a PDS alumni, argued in an article called "The Imperative for Criminal Justice Reform" that a good prosecutor is someone who is committed to reduce incarceration, eliminate racial disparities, and provide second chances. And for me, as a former public defender and a former innocence protection attorney, I came into this office with a core set of beliefs that my time in office has only reinforced. And those are that not every problem needs to be criminalized. Not every crime has to lead to punishment. Not every punishment has to result in incarceration. And that not every instance of incarceration has to be so punitive that it makes no room for redemption or rehabilitation. Brad made the point that we are the most carceral of nations. And I would go even further and say that incarceration is a defining feature of our culture. It's not just one dimension or one way of how our culture punishes crime. It really is who we've become. And he gave some statistics about the amount we spend, but this is one that I think is actually really astonishing, because the only thing that we spend more money on in this country then prison is war. So we spend the most money on war and the second most money on prisons. And my hope is that, talking about restorative justice, trying to create a more restorative system will actually reverse that trend. And the video talked about it a little bit, but in a retributive system, which is what we have right now, the three questions that the system asks are what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished. In a restorative system, which is not just a program, but it's a mindset. And it's hopefully a mindset that will really bring about culture change. In the restorative system, the three questions are: what was the harm? What does the person harmed need to heal? And who is responsible for that healing? Excuse me. Right now, the retributive system that we have, every single response at every single stage separates the person who's harmed and the person who did the harm, rather than trying to bring them together to help both be more than just the harm that happened to them, and to be more than the thing that they did, the worst thing that they've done to harm another person. So we don't have a system that is really set up to create public safety. And one of the ways in which we know that is that 50% of victims of violent crime actually never report. And so half of the people who experience violence in their lives choose nothing over what our legal system has to offer them. And I focus on victims not because they're the only parties that should be focused on, but I think it balances out what Sheba was saying earlier, is that the havoc that the system wreaks on the lives of not just people who do harm and not just people who end up in prison, but also their families, and against the fact that victims aren't even happy with the system. And so half of the people who experience violence, if they're not reporting, it means that they don't want what we have to offer. And I have conducted a couple of listening sessions, and we'll be doing more listening sessions with victims. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of victims are also people who have done harm. And there's not a clear distinction, between somebody who does harm and somebody who is harmed. But what we also see is that there is a real trust deficit between communities and the legal system. And that trust deficit is what causes people to not report. And it's what is actually making us, I think, less safe. And I'll talk about really quickly the sort of 5 things that go into a restorative process. And those 5 steps, rather, those are sort of acknowledging one's responsibility, and that's sort of fundamentally is truth telling. And it involves abandoning the array of responses, including denial, including minimization, including excuses, to really become sort of exposed to judgment and consequences. And it's a place to start to answer why something happened. And I think that's what, when I talk to victims, the question that they want most answered is why. They want to know why then. And their sense of security and safety doesn't really become established again until they understand why it is that something happened to them. The second step is acknowledging the impact of one's actions on others. It's a really hard thing to do, to acknowledge and live with the fact that we've caused someone harm. It takes away the ability of a person to think things are not all that different because of what they did. It requires listening, it builds empathy, and doing this can actually be harder than serving time, because it really requires people to face the people whose lives they've changed. And it's powerful and it's useful for the people that have been harmed because they feel seen and they feel heard, and it connects them with community, it grounds their experience, and it demonstrates that they matter. The third step is expressing genuine remorse, which is really critical, and that belongs sort of in the world of accountability in a way that really can't ever, that punishment really can't, ever really do. Punishment is something that someone else does to someone else, whereas remorse shifts an external motivation to an internal motivation. And that internal motivation that we have not to feel shame and not to feel like we're hurting people is really more powerful in the end than the extrinsic motivation of not serving time or not getting caught. And this is better for victims too, because we rarely find healing in other people's suffering. Simple incarceration won't on its own provide real succor for people who have been harmed. The fourth step is doing sorry, and that involves taking actions to repair harm to the degree possible and guided whenever feasible by the people who've been harmed. I mean, part of what we hear one subset of what people say that victims want, but the vast majority of victims are not actually being heard. So when someone, when just seeing somebody go to prison and be incarcerated actually doesn't create the healing itself, and going through the legal process actually re-traumatizes victims in a significant way. The fourth step is doing sorry, and it's doing sorry, not saying sorry, it's doing sorry, which means taking actions to repair harm to the degree possible and guided by the people harmed. And then finally, it's no longer committing that similar harm. And that requires a sense of self-worth. It requires a sense of dignity. It requires demonstrating respect for others. It's requiring an understanding of one's emotional state, one's psychological state, physical state, and social responses to people's experience. And it's being responsible in their people's day-to-day lives and being able to ask for help and work with others, learn how to communicate effectively, have empathy, learn how to cope with stressors, and deal with the problems in one's life. And I'll say this about restorative justice. Study after study and meta-study after meta-study show about a 90+ satisfaction rate amongst people who've been harmed. So those folks are, would recommend restorative justice to other people. They would do it again, and they actually feel satisfied with the system. And then if you look at the recidivism rates of people who are engaged, who did harm and are engaged in restorative justice, what you see over and over again is reduced recidivism. But you see human beings flourishing too, and you see the harm that they've suffered as well being healed. And so I think that restorative justice is one of the tools that we can really use to transform not just our criminal legal system, but our society.
Thank you, Parissa. I think that's a really interesting point too that's often not talked enough about how the many ways that the current retributive system doesn't actually address victims' needs and desires, and the ways in which a restorative system might be able to address that. So now we're moving on to our question and answer section. If you have any questions, you can type it into the chat on the Facebook Live, and I'm going to turn it over now to Human Rights Commission member Sukari Pinnock-Fitz, and take it away, Sukari.
Thank you, Bill, and really thank you to the panelists. I thought I knew something about this topic, and now I've learned that there's so much more to learn. So what we want to do now is give folks who have taken the time to come on this evening to hear a little bit more about what it is you all have been sharing. We want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Let us know if your question is directed specifically to a particular panelist or if your question is for all of the panelists. And Anna, I'm going to rely on you to read out the questions if you're willing.
Sure, Sakari, I'd be glad to do that.
Thank you.
So there was a question, the first question on Facebook from Robert Legg. Can there be more deferred disposition outcomes?
So let's hear from each of you if you've got a response for Robert. If not, that's okay too. But I see you smiling, Sheba, so I'm I'm sensing that you've got a response.
I have a response. So deferred disposition is when a person is charged with an offense and they get the opportunity to do things like go to drug court or go to a mental health docket or not commit, but do community service, or maybe they are given an opportunity to have this judgment set aside, and in turn, they don't get in trouble for a set amount of time. The problem is the deferred disposition is a guilty verdict, period. And up until very recently, and probably going forward, the felony in this state is forever. We do have a record sealing bill, but looking at the preliminary data, there are going to be millions of people who do not benefit from record sealing. More serious offenses will not benefit. So sometimes deferred disposition is used, and it is great for a person to avoid jail time and things like that, and maybe be given what is considered a second chance. But the reality is they still deal with felonization and all of the collateral consequences that come along with it. So I would say and suggest alternative to incarceration, alternative to felony convictions, because the reality of it is a lot of crime happens because we're not looking at root causes. We're not looking at the lack of resources. We're not looking at what got that person into that position to commit an offense in the first place. We're not looking at affordability, ability to pay into fines, fees, restitution, and things like that. We're not looking at if there was an issue where a person needed some type of support system before they got into the judicial system. So it can be great in some circumstances, but I would really like to see alternatives to incarceration and felonization from the beginning as we look at an overall picture. Because when we have drug courts and mental health dockets, there's a ton of wraparound services that are provided for people, but there are no wraparound services for poverty, and looking at the overall picture of a person from the beginning.
Thank you, Sheba. And I see you nodding now, Brad. What would you add to this?
Everything Sheba says was spot on. I always agree with Sheba, and that was just totally right. I agree with all that. I would note also, though, so add another angle to that, another facet to this. So right now in Virginia, possession of narcotics is still a felony. Now, a place like Arlington, we recognize that drug use is, if it's to the level that it is dysfunctional, that's a disease. It's a disease of substance use disorder. If you right now had to rewrite a criminal code and you had to decide how are we going to deal with somebody who we find in possession of a rock of crack cocaine who's addicted to that drug, are you going to choose to subject that person to up to 10 years in prison? Are you going to choose to give them a felony conviction for the rest of their life that will keep them from voting, that will deprive them of other civil liberties, and that will keep them from, for example, getting student loans, public housing, and will seriously impair their ability to make a living in their lives? Will you do that, or would you do something different? And if we do something different, and I would imagine 9 out of 10 people who will watch this at any point would agree we should do something different than that, then why aren't we doing something different now? And so right now in Virginia, what I just described, that is the reality. A simple possession of drugs is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. It's a felony offense. There are over 20 states that have reduced punishment of drug possession from a felony to a misdemeanor. We should be the next one to do that. I know Parissa's office takes a humane approach generally to these cases, and they do what they can to help people who are seriously just struggling with drugs, or even, honestly, maybe they're not struggling with drugs and they were just having a good time with drugs. It's not something that deserves a felony either. But either way, they do their best, but they shouldn't have to, we shouldn't have to get creative. We should have a law. We should have the law across Virginia be something that that reflects our values and reflects research and reflects a modern view of both drug use and just the purpose of the criminal court system. So, and actually, my organization, we sponsored a bill to defelonize drug possession. We're going to do that again next year, and there's going to be a lot of support for that. So, those of you watching, if you care about this, stay tuned, and we hope to have your support.
So, Parissa, as the Commonwealth's attorney on our panel here, help us understand how the humaneness that's been discussed here is showing up in the way your office is prosecuting some of these offenders.
So I'm going to just, Sukari, and I don't mean any disrespect, but I prefer to not call people offenders. And I think what we call people is really important. And one of our guiding principles then is to try not to make anybody a felon unless they really need to be. And that includes for possession. But I also want to say that we use deferred dispositions. So they can function in the way that Sheba was talking about, where it ends up in a conviction. But the way that our office uses them is, pretty liberally. And what we try to do is, to have a deferred finding so that there's no finding of guilt. And, for 1 or 2 years or 6 months or whatever we think is appropriate, we either, suggest that folks get mental health treatment, drug treatment, stay out of trouble, get a GED, just do a variety of things that will actually, and the plan is really going to depend on, what their defense attorney puts together, what their needs are. And sometimes it's just as simple as stay out of trouble. And then at the end of that 2 years or 1 year or 6 months or whatever period of time it is, we'll either dismiss the charges outright, or if it's a felony, can reduce it to something that is not a felony. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people an opportunity to not even have a record created to begin with. We don't have the luxury of in Virginia, we don't charge. So I can't control the vast majority of charges because the police and the magistrate judges charge. But once something gets in, and I'm not sure why Sheba is smirking, but once something comes in, what we try to do is resolve it in a way that is, cognizant that, people are going to have massive collateral consequences, and their families are going to have massive collateral consequences. Families who didn't do anything wrong, right, are going to have massive collateral consequences when, if that person ends up being incarcerated. And so we really try to use these deferred dispositions in more than just possession cases, because I don't think they're particularly effective in possession cases anyway. So I think they're more effective in more serious cases.
So thank you, Parissa, and thanks for the language correction. Every time I attend one of these forums, I learn something new. It's why I keep coming back. I'm going to stay with you for just a moment. We've got a question from Cindy. Why can't we institute early release now to improve health care and conditions of confinement, not wait until July 2022? With the current shortage of correctional officers, everyone is at risk on every level. So I'm going to start with you, Parissa, and then we'll give Sheba and Brad opportunity to share what they want about this question.
Can I think about that? And
sure.
Pass.
Sheba should answer this. Sheba was big in advocacy for the earned sentence credits. I know she knows a lot more about this than I do. I know a little bit, though.
All right, Sheba, take it away.
So it's not our doing that says that, people shouldn't be released now. We've been fighting for people to be released since the governor issued his order in April 2021 based on COVID numbers, right? But when the legislators make a decision, they put these numbers in, and apparently Department of Corrections asks for time to work out the numbers and set a deadline or date of implementation that kind of ties everybody's hands. We would have them home now. We would have them home as soon as possible. But when you're talking about the legislation and the rules around things, that's kind of where we're stuck with. And I know that's not a great answer, but advocates wanted people home sooner than later, rather sooner than later.
I'll chime in on the policy aspect of that, because I know the person who's asking the question probably knows this, but a lot of other people don't. So there's this earned sentence credits bill that basically gives people more credit for time served in the Department of Corrections. And it was passed during the special session last year. So certain people can get out a little earlier. But the thing about this, and this is what you always see with policymaking when it comes to punishment, is it started as this bill that was for everybody, whether they committed a drug crime, a fraud offense, stealing, burglary, robbery, or a violent crime. And then over time, different interests come in and they say, no, we can't let these people out early. We can't let these people out early. We can't let these people out early. And then you just chip away. And then you have a bill that affects maybe 10, 15% of the people in Department of Corrections. So the idea was to reduce prison populations for people who can safely return to the community, which is frankly most of them. And then it just gets chipped away because of politics. And but the fact of the matter is, this is having a huge impact on not just the human beings that are in there, because their lives are ruined, but also their families and their communities. But beyond that, to people who care about this sort of thing, it's also just packing our prisons with, especially with older inmates. I learned this just last week. Between 2008 and 2018, the percentage of inmates in the Department of Corrections over the age of 50 went from 13.1% to over 21%. It like almost doubled in the period of 10 years. And it's just because people can't get over the idea that you commit a crime and you can never be forgiven and you can never be redeemed and we can never embrace you back into our community. And it's that mindset that is driving mass incarceration, because mass incarceration is driven by long sentences for violent crimes. And until we get through this, until we address this issue, address it head on, can people, and we're talking about restorative justice, can somebody who has committed a violent offense be restored to the community? The answer is yes. And the answer is not only can they be restored to their community, but they can in many cases restore the breach that they've created between the person, the community they offended against, and the individual they offended against. And like this is it's just something. It's so frustrating when you work in our criminal courts, because so few people take that perspective, and they frankly just lack empathy in that regard. And it really is causing huge problems to people's lives, but also just the whole way we do business, like I was talking about.
Yes, thank you for that. Pris, anything to add?
I don't think I have anything to add to that issue.
Okay, good enough. So as Richard asks, or just it starts with a statement that we hear a lot about defunding, which seems to scare members of the general public, and is asking if this the concept of justice reinvestment, which seems to be a similar notion, which would allow for reallocating money that could be spent on law enforcement and incarceration, that's currently spent on law enforcement and incarceration, and investing that money in communities. And that really does seem to be the theme that's running through, all of your comments, that what we're talking about here is how to help our communities be more resilient, how to welcome folks returning back to our communities, to be embraced and to find their place. And so he wants to know really, how can we encourage legislators, supervisors, mayors, city councils to invest in communities and people first, rather than more handcuffs, more jails, more people caged? And any one of you can can jump in.
Since I was the one who broached this topic, I will just say just briefly, people who are criminal justice reform advocates, public defenders too, we're quite good at criticizing things. We're quite good at getting rid of things and trying to get rid of things, and speaking about things we like that need to be done away with. So, but we're not so good at speaking about things in positive terms. Like, instead of speaking about something we need to take away, why don't we talk about something that we need to add, something that we're missing, and speak about it in that way. And because the thing about it with defunding the police, people think, oh, the police are the only people who are keeping me safe. So you want to get rid of the thing that's keeping me safe. No, that's not what we want to do. Just think that we think there's a better way to keep people safe than to be arresting everyone and be putting everybody in prison. So, but if you think about better messaging, better way to explain that to people, it's something that more people agree with, and you can make more progress. So I just wanted to add that point. And, I think, frankly, messaging is a huge part of the problem with making advances with policy, because you hear sorry, I'm not going to swear. I'm not going to swear. I'm not at work right now. But you heard Terry McAuliffe 2 weeks ago, he gets triggered by some, Republican sheriff. Sorry, I'm sure the Republicans watching. I'm not a Republican, but anyway. And he gets triggered and he starts talking about I'd never defund the police. I stand with the police. And he had an opportunity right then and there to explain what criminal justice reform is about, and correct this guy's ignorance, correct the public's ignorance. And instead what he did is, what he communicated to the public is, this is a bad thing, and we do need to oppose it. And everybody is just as ignorant today as they were 2 weeks ago, who doesn't know more about this topic. So I think a huge part of making progress really is just getting people informed, letting them know what these reforms really all are about, and you go from there.
I mean, I can speak to how important messaging is, and how important the fact of bringing an alternative is, because that was my entire campaign, was provide drug treatment instead of locking people up for possession, provide mental health care instead of putting people in jail and criminalizing mental health or mental illness. And I think when you talk about the infrastructure that needs to be built in order to make us safer, really truly make us safer, based on what evidence tells us makes us safer, which is prevention and healthcare and housing and education and hope. When you focus on those things, it's really hard to argue, even across our ideological lines. It's really hard to argue that people shouldn't get mental health care. It's really hard to argue that people shouldn't get drug treatment. It's really hard to argue that people shouldn't have job opportunities or educational opportunities. So when you frame it as what we need to prevent bad things from happening, and then when bad things happen, to be able to bring people back and let them actually make up for what happened and flourish themselves. I think when you put it in those terms, it's really hard, whether you are a libertarian or whether you are a person of faith, or whether you're a progressive, whatever. And even if you're a Republican who sort of believes in small government, right? Spend money on things that work, right? Instead of investing over and over again, good money after bad, on things that demonstrably don't work. So I think that messaging on that piece is important. And I think the media has a real responsibility to, do better, because the challenge, I think, of any of this reform movement is that when criminal justice reform works, nothing happens. Nothing happens. So there's nothing to write about. When 99 out of 100 people who go home pre-trial, just go about their business and pick up their kids from school or go to the grocery store or maybe apply for a job. That's not a story. And the sad thing is that, the only kind of criminal justice stories that ever are written that anybody ever finds interesting are, there's two kinds. There's, terrible things have happened, and there's the story about innocence cases where, really, like, they're written as feel-good stories, but really they're stories about how our system messed up.
Thank you for that. Sheba, I see you've got something to say on this one too. Come on in.
I want lay people, I want to first say this. It is our responsibility to be educated and educate ourselves and not just listen to sound bites. When we're talking about violent versus nonviolent, right? That should be the furthest thing from your mind, and that should be the furthest thing should be swayed, because if we're being honest, people who are convicted of violent offenses reoffend less. They go back to prison less. And it's not because they get these uber long sentences. It is because a lot of times there are crimes of opportunity, there are crimes of passion, whatever the reason is, but most people do not commit those offenses again. Now, that is a piece that a lot of people won't talk about, because the media will, like Parissa said, they will only harp on the horrible things, the most, degrading things. But if I'm arrested, my mugshot is shown on the TV. Nothing else shows about how I'm a mother, how I'm a business owner, how I graduated from college. And if I am not convicted, nobody comes back and corrects that wrong. Nobody comes back and says, this is what happened in the case, and this person's life should not be upended because we splattered their picture all across the media. So I want lay people to understand this. Think about the disinvestment that has happened in communities for far too long. We're not, when we say defund the police, it is because we are pissed and tired of the number one budget line item being public safety and not giving the results. Do I feel safer because $3 million go to public safety, but my teachers are struggling to survive and working 2 and 3 jobs? If we're not just talking about criminal justice, we're talking about the fact that if I have a substance use disorder, I have to get arrested and put in handcuffs to even be considered for most programming. If I have a mental health deficiency, I have to go through a process of being put in handcuffs before I can get some assistance. Because if I call on my family member who is clearly struggling with the thing and I say they need help, there's no option. There's no option other than taking them to jail or prison before they get some help, right? So we should be thinking forward about the disinvestment in programs, the disinvestment in resources, the fact that our minimum wage was $7.25, and that was acceptable for far too long. We say housing is a right, but we have the ability to legally discriminate against a person who has a past criminal record. And that is the only means of legal discrimination, because if you are of a certain demographic, if you are gay, if you can't discriminate based on source of income, you can't discriminate because of religion, you can't discriminate for all of these lists of reasons. But if you have a past conviction, they can say you can't live in the safe, affordable housing. That is the only means of legal discrimination. And we have to stop if we think that the foundation of housing would make a person not commit a crime. So, I want people to think about what's been disinvested from for so long. I want people to think about what's been taken away from people for so long, and how we expect people to prosper with little to nothing. So it's not even necessarily about saying, take everything away from the police. We don't want police in our communities. It is about saying that we want to prioritize our people. We want to prioritize everybody. We want fair and equal and equitable grounding for everybody.
So Sheba, as I've been listening to you, I've heard you connect a number of systems. This panel has been talking mostly about the criminal justice system. However, you mentioned housing as another system that disenfranchises. You've mentioned mental health care, the healthcare system, the education system. So we've got all of these systems that are working in unison, right, to kind of hold in place structures that we're starting to understand just don't work for healthy, resilient communities. So Sincere asks, given all of these facts that you've shared with us, how do you convince lawmakers of these facts in order to make real change when they use alternative facts to keep these systems that oppress in place? And again, any one of the panelists can pick up this question and move forward with it.
I'll answer that, but can I add an Arlington spin to what Sheba just said?
Sure.
I completely agree 100% with her. So here's a good example. So Arlington County Police Department's budget has increased $20 million over the past 10 years. Last week, there was a big, over the last month, there's been this big to-do about the fact that there's low officer morale. Many people are leaving the force. I think that is true. Arlington County Board, however, responded by saying they would give them $3 million more for retention and hiring. I don't really think it's a money problem. You got $23 million over 10 years. But you know what you don't have in Virginia or in Arlington, for example? You don't have a long-term residential substance abuse treatment program. $3 million would probably open one of those and probably keep it running for at least a year or two. Like, why don't you take those $3 million? And that's going to be a better investment in community safety than, $3 million for officer recruitment and training, or however they're going to use it. And I don't say that to disrespect the police. I want them to be, educated and well-trained and have good people there too. But it's just like, we just have our priorities all mixed up. And nobody knows. Does anybody know like that we don't have a long-term residential substance abuse treatment program in Arlington? The only one we have is in the jail. So if judges think somebody needs substance abuse treatment, they put them in the jail for 9 months, and they do a program called the ACT unit. Most other places, and places that are far less wealthy than Arlington is, have long-term residential substance abuse treatment options. We simply don't. So, that's, as a community, we can do better on that front. Now, as far as the question regarding how do you convince lawmakers, I mean, I know my approach is just. I think that if you can have conversations with people where you're actually talking about facts. So there was once upon a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when criminal justice reform was a unicorn in the policy sphere. Unicorn in that it earned bipartisan support. And Parissa talked about this before. It earned support from libertarians, small government conservatives, people of faith, progressives, leftists. A whole lot of folks supported criminal justice reform, and they support it because it makes perfect sense. If you bother to learn the facts about it, you bother to learn what's going on in our justice system, there are better answers. There's a better approach. We've been talking about it all night. The problem is you can't count on the media to inform people. I tell you, I mean, a lot of these issues are just very nuanced. And in the Washington Post, they're going to limit their articles to 500 or 700 words. I can't explain why mandatory minimums are unjust. Well, actually, I can't explain why mandatory minimums are unjust in 700 words. But if you want me to explain, restorative justice or, like the complexity of the issues that Sheba was just talking about with disinvestment in communities, like you can't get those. They're nuanced points. They're not good for sound bites. And then, so you have to have these honest conversations with people. And then there's a lack of advocates and a lack of people who really care enough to inform themselves and then have those conversations to inform their legislators. So we try to do this by getting more people involved, by getting the people who really know what's up involved, getting also especially directly affected individuals and communities involved in advocacy, and starting to have those conversations. And we believe that if you do that, then and legislators and elected officials are earnestly and honestly listening to you, then you can convince them. It's just that's a huge lift, requires so much support, but that's how we look at it, or how I look at it at least.
Thank you. Parissa, what else would you add to this?
I would just say that we are, in addition to what Brad said, that we have a very bad habit in this country of trying to fix things, very quickly. And we only seem to have one answer for every problem of public safety, and that answer is more jails, more prisons. And when we've spent decades, really not thinking creatively, not looking at root causes, because it's complex and nuanced and not an easy, fast answer, you end up where we are, where the only answer to every single question is cages.
Yeah, it is complex, it is nuanced, and one of the reasons the Human Rights Commission wanted to choose this topic for the Tiffany Joslyn Forum was we want members of the Arlington community to be able to hear from people who are actually, in the weeds with these issues, and have the opportunity to get some of these facts, to not be rushed, and to have you share what you think is important for members of the Arlington community to know. And so with that, I'd like to give each of you another 5 minutes or so to kind of close out. If you've got closing statements, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So Anna, are you tracking any other questions that I'm not seeing?
No, I don't believe there are any others.
Okay. All right. So in conclusion, what is it you would like those of us who are on this evening to know? And anyone may start, and then the next person can pick it up from there.
I don't need the last word, so I can go first. The one thing that we haven't really touched on is just this. Well, Sheba talked about it a little bit, but all the pushback this year to things that didn't even happen. It's like there's all this there's this mythical crime wave narrative that's floating around the media, and especially like certain political campaigns, and they're talking about things that never happened. They're using the defund word to, even though the Virginia legislature didn't do anything of the sort, they boosted police budgets. And another one that I tweeted about yesterday, but that just infuriates me like nothing else, is these ads about the parole board in Virginia, and like this parole board that's keeping our streets are full of dangerous, violent criminals. And so I went ahead and looked at like parole board data last night. So there were 2019, there were 13,000 people who got out of the Department of Corrections after serving prison sentences. Guess how many were released as a result of parole board decisions? It was 140 of them. 140 out of 13,000 people. There are a total of, out of 62,000 people on supervision, some kind of probation or parole in Virginia. How many are on supervised parole? It's less than 2,000. This is just a minuscule number of people, and that's because parole was abolished in Virginia in 1994. So, but does anybody know this? And they're running ads about this, that there's something to be scared about. And the last fact that I would add on this is that in 2019 also, how many parole violators there were? People who violated parole. Out of that 1,844 people, less than 2,000 people, only 30 of them violated parole that whole year. And those are the people. This is the thing that these politicians are telling us we should be afraid of. And it's not called out by the media. Nobody knows any better because they're not informing themselves, but people need to inform themselves because this stuff really, really, really matters. And these are the narratives that are being used by people who completely disagree with the focus of this commission of human rights. They want to roll back human rights. They want to roll back civil rights. And we need to be prepared as, concerned citizens, advocates, whoever we are. We need to know this stuff. Like Sheba said, we need to get ourselves informed. It's on us to get ourselves informed, to care about racial justice, to care about equal justice. So my final word would be, please stay tuned in. Find the organizations that get you the information, the facts. like No Left Turns, Justice Forward, Virginia. I know Humanization Project was showing up. Sisters in Prison Reform are here tonight. ACLU, Virginia, Legal Aid Justice Center, and I know there are probably many I'm leaving out, but there are so many great grassroots advocacy organizations working on these issues right now. And, our great Commonwealth Attorney is also, has been a leader on these issues. So listen, stay tuned in, get yourselves informed, and let's keep making progress.
Thank you, Brad. Sheba or Parissa, which one of you would like to go next?
Well, Sheba is more articulate than me, so I think I'm going to take this opportunity to go so that she can close this out. I just want to sort of take a step back and really bring home the point that the criminal legal system is an extraordinarily blunt tool. We form community because we want to live better lives. We want to be safer. We want to be happier. And the truth is that sometimes some folks engage in behaviors that detract from what we would call our beloved community. And what happens is that we end up having to find a way to protect the community. But of all of the tools that we use to discourage, limit, or otherwise prescribe behavior to protect the community, the criminal legal system is the most blunt tool we have. And it comes with the highest economic, social, human, and generational costs. Economically, the costs are high because the system requires an extraordinary number of extremely expensive primary actors: police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, pretrial officers, sheriffs, probation and correction officers, and probably more that I'm not even thinking of. But it also requires an even larger and not any less expensive secondary expert and administrative staff to support these primary actors. And it may be true that it takes a village to raise a child, but it really takes an army to prosecute a person. And as I said before, the only thing that we spend more money on as a country than prisons is war. And if what we're doing worked, we would be the safest society in human history. But socially, when prosecution, even when it doesn't result in incarceration, a criminal record, as Sheba pointed out, poses a lifetime risk of being shut out of a long catalog of social goods and benefits, including the primary job market, including security clearance, including school loans and public housing. And all of this has significant economic and health impacts on our communities. On a human level, coming into contact with the criminal justice system can be enormously and sometimes permanently disruptive to a person's personal life and family life, to the point where one minor prosecution may very well mushroom into more serious ones. And generationally, the system has never fallen equally on everyone. And we know that it falls the hardest on Black people, on brown people, on poor people, and on immigrants. And this is particularly true, to circle back to what Sheba said earlier, of the war on drugs, aspects of which in its inception were actually engineered to stoke racial fears. By contrast, we have developed a whole robust set of tools other than criminalization to deal with behavior that we believe needs to be regulated, that don't come with such high costs, like government monopolies, administrative control, taxation, public health, education. So if the question is, how do we regulate a behavior, the answer usually has been just criminalize it. If the behavior poses a danger to public safety, welfare, and well-being, and if there are no other effective and less costly means of achieving regulation, that's fine. But as a reformer, I would suggest that we should reserve this extraordinarily blunt instrument for the categories of behavior that truly present a threat to safety and welfare. And it doesn't mean we have to tolerate horrific acts. It just means we should ask ourselves, do we possess less blunt tools to deal with these behaviors? And what are those?
Great questions. So Sheba, we're going to give you the opportunity to start to close out the conversation. It's been a rich conversation, lots and lots of facts. I've learned a lot. And so how will you help us close out this evening?
So I leave you all with a charge, and it is simple in theory. It is not simple in action, but try it anyway. Love your neighbor, even when they do things that are different than you do them. The very basic act of trying to understand something that is bigger than yourself will take us a very long way. People who have been disenfranchised for centuries are now regaining the ability to vote and participate in a system that has used and abused them for decades. But you did not just get your right to vote back. You got your right to serve on a jury back. You got your right to be a notary public. And most importantly, you got your right to run for and hold public office. I saw the question in the chat that said, how do we get our legislators to listen when the data is there, when the information is there, when the facts are there, and they still choose to use alternative facts? Sometimes it is important to stand in your truth, share your story, address the opposition, not just those who agree with what you have going on. And if all else fails, vote them out and run for office and hold that position, because I will support you when you stand in your truth, no matter what and no matter who you are. Get involved. Be a person who holds your neighbor not just accountable, but be there to support them when they fail, so that the traps of the criminal and juvenile legal systems are not the only answers to what helps them and what holds them. It is very important that if we all want to see the best Virginia we can see, that we take an active role in other people's positions, not just our own bubble. So that is all I got.
Well, and it was a lot. I hear you calling us in as citizens to do what it is we can. We know we've got an important election coming up. Some of you all have alluded to, you know, these different competing ads about what keeps us safe in Virginia. I know I'm going to be doing a lot more research myself, checking some of these so-called facts that show up probably 50 times a night in a 2-hour, visit to the TV set. I've just got these competing ads. And what you all have helped at least me understand is there's a lot more to know. I thought I knew something about this topic, but I've learned so much more by just spending this last hour and 15, 20 minutes or so hearing from you really, really informative people, and I appreciate it. Bill, I'm going to hand it back to you for any closing comments.
I think that's it. Actually, I think we're wrapped up now.
Well, okay then. Thanks everyone for spending your time with us this evening. We really appreciate it. The work of the Arlington County Human Rights Commission is work we do on behalf of this community. So if you have ideas, if there are things you want us to know more about, we're really easy to find. Just Google us and we'll be happy to respond. Thank you. Thank you. Really, you all were great. Just really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks. Enjoyed being here.